Australia is stepping up its war against the drug ice. The Prime Minister has just announced a national task force will be set up to coordinate local, state and federal efforts against the use, sale, manufacture and importation of crystal methamphetamine.
The trouble with ice is that it is far more potent, far more dangerous, far more addictive than any previous illicit drug. It's worse than heroin, it's worse than cocaine, it's worse than LSD. It's worse than ecstasy. It's much more addictive, much more dangerous, much more damaging. The chances of being able to function while being a serious ice user are almost zero. And that's why it's so important that we ramp up our response. This is a drug epidemic way beyond anything that we have seen before now. And I am determined that right around our country we will take every possible step to combat this dreadful, dreadful scourge.
Prime Minister Tony Abbott speaking just a short time ago, announcing a national task force in the efforts against ice. Well, the recently retired Victorian Police Commissioner Ken Lay will chair this task force, which will develop a national ice action strategy by the middle of this year. John Ryan is the CEO of the Penington Institute, which works with people and families affected by drug abuse. He's also a member of Victoria's Ice Action Taskforce. John Ryan, welcome again to Breakfast.
Good morning, Fran.
John, we just heard the Prime Minister there describe ice as, quote, an epidemic way beyond anything we have seen before now. He went on to say ice is ruining the lives of individuals, destroying families, hurting communities. Is he right? Is ice a sort of a drug scourge beyond anything we've seen before in this country?
Look, I think that's probably over-egging it. The fact of the matter is ice is a big issue and it's definitely devastating lots of families, but there's lots of drug problems in our community, including alcohol. Obviously, tobacco kills the most people, but also pharmaceutical misuse is actually considerably on the rise, and we've still got problems even with heroin. So, yes, ice is a significant problem, but it's not the end of the world.
Well, how much do we need this national task force, this national approach? I know current New South Wales Police Commissioner Andrew Scipione last year was calling for it. I think you and others said it was a good idea. What will that do and what should it focus on?
Look, I think it is a good idea, and congratulations to the Prime Minister for taking the issue seriously. We've been alerting federal politicians for a number of years now and wrote to everyone, all politicians in 2013 in the Annex Bulletin, which is a publication for frontline workers. That's since been defunded by this government, but neither government's got really clean skin in relation to these issues. Nicola Roxon herself, as Health Minister, defunded amphetamine-related action when she was the Health Minister. So we've got a pretty knee-jerk response to these issues, and I think a national approach is valuable, but we need to get over our governmental addiction to this sort of command and control approach. I think if the national task force is going to acknowledge that the problem is at the local community level and the solution is at the local community level, then it will be a success. If we just continue on with this idea that we can block supply, that we can arrest our way out of it, as they say, we're doomed to fail.
I want to come back to that, what the work action at the community level might look like, but just in terms of arresting our way out of that, Ken Lay is the recently retired Commissioner of the Victorian Police Force. He's going to chair this task force. He's by all accounts, a terrific guy and did a good job with the Victorian Police in many areas. But are you concerned about having a former police chief in charge of the task force?
Look, I think that Ken Lay is, as you say, an excellent Chief Commissioner, and I think he's an outstanding Australian. I'm very confident that he'll take a sensible approach to this. He himself has said something to the effect that we can't arrest our way out of these problems. We've really got to look at health, education and employers, etc., stepping up to the plate. So as long as Ken Lay is surrounded by the support that's required, considering the urgent timelines that the Prime Minister has laid down, then I think it could well be a successful approach.
It is a short-term timeline. They need to report by the middle of the year, and I think they're going to come up with a COAG strategy which brings in all the states. The Australian Crime Commission recently reported that 1.3 million Australians have tried either ice or speed, both methamphetamines, which is amongst the highest usage in the world per capita. Is there, the Crime Commission also showed that transnational criminal gangs have moved in on the act. Is this one reason to make it a national approach? Because border control, you don't want to wrest your way out of it, but borders and transnational crime gangs are something that really require a national response?
Well, they do, but we're pouring most of our money in relation to drugs into law enforcement, and you know, drugs are readily available in country towns and the big cities. So if we keep doing that, we're going to fail. And if we keep doing this sort of scaremongering with people who are using drugs or might use drugs, we're going to fail, because people know that ice is a risky drug. They know that it's dangerous, and yet they're continuing to use it. So we've really got to go back to the basic fundamental of speaking to people in a sensible and sober fashion, not in a scaremongering fashion. So the idea that we can scare people out of it, or law and order our way out of this problem, that's historical and has, you know, failed.
It's 18 to 9. We're speaking with John Ryan, CEO of the Penington Institute and a member of the Victorian Ice Action Taskforce. Let's go to that then. How should we be speaking to people? How do we deal with this at the community level? I noticed that Andrew Scipione, the New South Wales Commissioner last year, said we have to talk about the problem, make people realise that, you know, you're not protected simply because it hasn't touched you yet. What do you think dealing with ice at the community level might look like?
Well, I think that's absolutely true. We've got to be talking about these issues, and we've got to be talking about them a lot and honestly, and that's a real challenge because, you know, we've run so many community forums and family members have said, I know nothing about this drug, but I fear that my child is using it. We've got to actually support those families with reasonable and sensible information. They've got to have that readily accessible, and it's got to be credible. It can't be scaremongering. But the same goes to people who are actually using the drug. The slide into addiction with ice can be extremely quick. It can take as little as a few months, and people's lives can be really off the rails. What are we doing to educate drug users in a realistic way about how they can prevent problems in relation to their drug use? We'd like to sweep that under the carpet and not address the fact that there's, you know, hundreds of thousands of people who've risked taking this drug and walked away without any problems. But for those that have actually developed a problem, well, we do very little in terms of realistic education. How do you prevent a psychosis? Well, how do you prevent ice-related psychosis? You prevent it by managing your consumption. How do you manage your consumption? You need to have breaks, you need to keep your nutrition, you need to keep your hydration, you need to reduce poly-drug use. So there's ways that communities can actually reduce the harm more effectively, just as there's ways that we can, you know, potentially, rely on border control with some level of success. We need to actually be talking to drug users about how they can manage with some level of success. And obviously then the question is whether or not there's adequate access to drug treatment, because often the people who run into problems have got whole lots of complexity in their life, and they do need our care in the community, and often drug treatment is just not available. And
just on the sort of problems in people's lives, I think some of us have been surprised to see on 7:30 last night that report that's suggesting use of ice is not, I don't know, widespread, might be overstating it, but is an issue within some elements of the Navy, especially over in Perth at the Stirling Naval Base, apparently was where the focus of that was. We've had the notion of truckies using ice and having rendezvous at truck stops to get their meth-amphetamine supply, that sort of thing. We've talked before, and I think to you, about the problem with regional communities. It all goes to how widespread it is, but also to think that, you know, a group like the Navy might be afflicted by this scourge goes to education. In a group like that, you should be able to make some impact on a community like that, shouldn't you?
Well, absolutely you should, and it is about education, but it's also about providing a context where people can actually talk about it when they've got problems, and people, you know, mates can support each other. We don't do nearly enough in terms of expecting each other to care in relation to someone going off the rails on ice. That's a real challenge at the local community level, which we're not meeting. And the same, you know, of course it applies to the Navy, but it applies across all professions and all workforces. And, you know, what are employers doing about drug use within their workforce? Are they actually having honest conversations about it? Mostly they're not.
We're about to be joined, speaking of honest conversations, hopefully we'll be having one in a moment with Michael Keenan, the Justice Minister, who has in the recent past described ice as this, quote, mind-eating, personality-distorting, life-ending drug. What's the first question we should be putting to the Justice Minister, do you think?
Well, I think the question is, how are you going to actually address the needs of families in local communities? So the old command and control model, we've been investing a fortune in it, but how do we actually support local communities? That's the fundamental question. And
in terms of treatment, I mean, treatment is a costly, it's the sort of rough end of this. It's costly in all types of drug and alcohol. We just never have enough treatment for these kind of things. What's the benchmark there?
Well, look, I don't think it is expensive compared to the actual cost of not addressing it. So the cost to the health system, the law and order system, etc., of untreated addiction is much greater than actually preventing and then intervening early with drug treatment. So it's very cost effective. And there's lots of support the government could provide for mutual support groups, you know, like Smart Recovery, these sort of organisations where drug users who are trying to recover from their addiction support each other. It's not actually expensive, and even the cost that it does cost, the return on investment makes it worthwhile.
John Ryan, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Fran.
John Ryan is the CEO of the Penington Institute, a member of Victoria's Ice Action Taskforce.